They laughed at me the entire dinner, called me a failure, a burden, a joke. But what they didn't know was chilling every plate they ordered, every word they spoke, every moment they enjoyed, was paid for by the very person they were humiliating. And by the end of the night, I wasn't the one being embarrassed anymore. The message from my mother appeared on my phone in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, interrupting the quiet rhythm of my day. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, reading the same short line over and over again. Family dinner tonight. Don't be late. There was no greeting, no warmth, no hint of affection, just an order. That was always her way. Even after all these years, nothing had really changed. The words felt heavy, not because of what they said, but because of everything they didn't. It wasn't an invitation. It was a reminder of where I stood in the family expected to show up, expected to listen, expected to stay in my place. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath, trying to decide how I felt about it. Part of me wanted to ignore the message entirely, to pretend I never saw it, and continue with my life like I had learned to do so many times before. But another part of me knew that skipping it would only lead to more messages, more pressure, more judgment. My parents had a way of making silence feel like guilt. If I didn't go, it would become another story they could tell about me, another example of how I failed as a son. And I was tired of giving them reasons, even if those reasons were unfair to begin with. I placed my phone on the table, but my mind stayed locked on that message. Family dinner. It sounded simple enough, something most people would look forward to. But for me, those words carried years of tension, quiet insults, and moments that had shaped who I had become. Every dinner with them followed the same pattern. My brother would dominate the conversation, talking about his achievements, his promotions, his perfect life. My parents would listen with pride, their faces lighting up in ways I had rarely seen directed at me. And then, almost like clockwork, the attention would shift. That shift was always subtle at first. A small comment, a casual question that didn't feel so casual. "What have you been up to lately?" my father would ask, already expecting disappointment. Or my mother would smile thinly and say, "Still figuring things out?" Those moments would build, slowly turning into something sharper, something harder to ignore. By the end of the night, I would be sitting there quietly, absorbing their words, pretending they didn't affect me as much as they did. I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. People moved through the streets with purpose, each one carrying their own stories, their own struggles. From the outside, everything looked normal, almost peaceful. But inside, I felt that familiar tension building again. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something more complicated, a mix of frustration, anticipation, and something deeper that I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the feeling of unfinished business, of things left unsaid. The strange part was that this time felt different. I couldn't explain it fully, but there was a quiet confidence sitting beneath my thoughts, something steady and unshaken. The version of me they remembered, the one they expected to see, was no longer the same person standing here now. Life had moved forward, even if they hadn't noticed. I had built something for myself, piece by piece, without their approval or support. And yet, despite everything I had achieved, I had kept it hidden from them. Not out of fear, but out of choice. I picked up my phone again and looked at the message one more time. "Don't be late." The words almost made me smile this time, but not in a way they would understand. There was something ironic about it, something almost amusing. They believed they were still in control, still setting the rules, still deciding how things would go. They had no idea how much had changed, how much power had quietly shifted over time. I typed a short reply. "I'll be there." Simple. Direct. Just enough to meet their expectations without giving anything away. As soon as I sent it, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The decision had been made. I would go to the dinner just like they wanted. I would sit at the table, listen to their words, and watch everything unfold the way it always did. But this time, I wouldn't be walking in as the same person they thought they knew. I moved back to my desk, trying to focus on my work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the evening ahead. I could already picture the restaurant, the lighting, the way the conversation would flow. I could hear their voices, their laughter, their familiar tone of quiet judgment. And yet, instead of feeling weighed down by it, I felt something else building inside me. Something controlled, something patient. It wasn't about proving them wrong in the way they expected. It was about something deeper, something they wouldn't see coming. I checked the time and realized there were only a few hours left before the dinner. Enough time to prepare, enough time to think, but not enough time to change my mind. Not that I wanted to anymore. Whatever happened tonight, it wouldn't be like before. I knew that much with certainty. And for the first time in a long while, the idea of facing them didn't feel like a burden. It felt like the beginning of something I had been waiting for without even realizing it. Growing up in my house meant learning early that love was not given equally. It was measured, compared, and often withheld. My older brother was always the standard, the example I was supposed to follow, but could never quite reach. From the outside, we looked like a normal family. But inside, everything revolved around him. His achievements were celebrated loudly, proudly, as if they belonged to everyone. Mine, when they existed at all, were either ignored or quietly dismissed. Over time, I stopped expecting recognition. It was easier that way. I remember sitting at the dinner table as a child, listening to my parents talk about my brother's accomplishments like they were stories worth repeating every single day. His grades, his awards, the compliments from his teachers, everything became part of a narrative that painted him as perfect. I would sit there quietly, pushing food around my plate, waiting for the conversation to shift, even for a moment. Sometimes it did, but not in the way I hoped. When attention finally turned to me, it wasn't to praise, but to question, to compare, to remind me of how far behind I was. "You should learn from your brother," my father would say, his voice firm but controlled. My mother would nod in agreement, adding small comments that carried more weight than they seemed. "Why can't you be more focused?" Or, "He works harder than you." Those words didn't come with anger, they came with disappointment, which somehow felt worse. Anger fades quickly, but disappointment lingers, shaping the way you see yourself over time. At school, I tried to prove them wrong. I worked harder than anyone realized, staying up late, pushing myself to do better. But even when I succeeded, it never felt like enough. If I brought home good grades, my parents would ask why they weren't better. If I achieved something small, it was overshadowed by something bigger my brother had done. It became a pattern I couldn't escape. No matter what I did, I was always one step behind in their eyes. The comparisons weren't always direct. Sometimes they were subtle, hidden in casual conversations or offhand remarks. Relatives would visit, and my parents would proudly talk about my brother's future, his plans, his potential. When it came to me, the tone would change. "He's still figuring things out," they would say, offering a polite smile that didn't quite reach their eyes. I learned to recognize that smile. It was the same one they used when they didn't believe in something but didn't want to say it out loud. As I grew older, the gap between how we were treated only became more obvious. My brother was given opportunities, support, and encouragement at every step. When he wanted to try something new, my parents were there to back him up. When I asked for the same support, the response was different. There were always questions, doubts, reasons why it might not work. It wasn't that they said no outright. It was that they made me feel like I shouldn't even ask. Eventually, I stopped asking. I stopped sharing my plans, my ideas, even my small successes. It felt pointless to bring something to the table if it was only going to be dismissed or compared. Instead, I learned to keep things to myself, to build quietly, without expecting approval. It wasn't a decision I made all at once. It happened slowly, shaped by years of small moments that added up to something much bigger. There were times when I wondered if I was overreacting, if maybe I was just imagining the difference. But then something would happen, a comment, a look, a conversation that made it clear that nothing had changed. Those moments brought everything back into focus. They reminded me that in my parents' eyes, I was still the one who hadn't lived up to expectations, the one who needed to do more, be more, prove more. What made it harder was that I still cared. No matter how much I tried to distance myself emotionally, a part of me still wanted their approval. I wanted to hear them say they were proud of me, even once, without hesitation or comparison. That desire didn't disappear. It just became quieter, buried under layers of acceptance and reality. I learned to function without it, but I never fully let it go. Over time, I started to see things more clearly. It wasn't just about me not being enough. It was about how they defined success, how they chose who to value and why. My brother fit their expectations perfectly, and I didn't. That difference shaped everything. Understanding that didn't erase the pain, but it helped me make sense of it. It allowed me to step back and see the situation for what it was, rather than constantly blaming myself. By the time I reached adulthood, the roles in our family felt fixed. My brother was the success story, the one they proudly talked about. I was the background character, the one they mentioned when necessary, but never highlighted. It became part of our identity as a family, something so deeply ingrained that no one questioned it anymore. Not even me, at least not out loud. But inside, something had already begun to shift. The years of being overlooked, underestimated, and compared had shaped me in ways they didn't understand. While they were busy focusing on my brother, I was learning, adapting, and building something of my own. Quietly, without their attention, without their expectations. And in that silence, I found a kind of strength they had never given me and never even noticed. The version of me my parents believed in was someone who never quite figured things out, someone stuck in a cycle of trying and failing. That image had stayed unchanged in their minds for years, even as my life moved in a completely different direction. What they didn't know, what I had carefully chosen not to share, was that I had built something real, something successful, entirely on my own. It wasn't an accident or sudden luck. It was the result of years of quiet effort, mistakes, and persistence that no one in my family had witnessed. It started small, almost insignificant at first. While everyone assumed I was still figuring things out, I was actually experimenting, testing ideas, and learning skills that no one had ever taught me. I didn't have guidance or encouragement, so I relied on observation and trial. I watched how people worked, how businesses operated, how opportunities appeared and disappeared. Every failure became a lesson, not something to be ashamed of. Without anyone expecting success from me, I had the freedom to fail without pressure, and that turned out to be one of my greatest advantages. In the beginning, there were moments of doubt. Late nights when things didn't work, when plans fell apart, and when it felt like maybe my parents had been right about me all along. Those thoughts were difficult to ignore, especially because they echoed voices I had heard my entire life. But instead of letting them stop me, I used them as fuel. I didn't want to prove them wrong in a loud or dramatic way. I wanted to build something so solid that it wouldn't need explanation. I worked quietly, often alone, focusing on progress rather than recognition. While others shared their achievements openly, I chose to stay in the background. There was a certain clarity in that choice. Without the need to impress anyone, I could focus entirely on what mattered: growth, stability, and long-term success. I learned how to manage risks, how to make decisions under pressure, and how to recover when things didn't go as planned. Each step forward was small, but consistent. As time passed, those small steps began to add up. What started as a simple idea gradually turned into something structured, something with real value. I built connections, formed partnerships, and created opportunities that didn't exist before. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was real. The more it grew, the more I realized how different my reality had become from the one my family imagined for me. What made it even more surprising was how easy it was to keep it hidden. My parents never asked detailed questions about my life, and when they did, their expectations were so low that simple answers satisfied them. If I said I was working on something, they assumed it was another failed attempt. If I stayed quiet, they filled in the gaps with their own assumptions. In a way, their lack of interest made it easier for me to stay invisible. There was also a part of me that preferred it that way. Keeping my success private gave me control. It allowed me to define my own identity without interference or judgment. I didn't have to deal with their opinions, their comparisons, or their expectations. I could build at my own pace, make decisions without pressure, and focus on what truly mattered. That independence became one of the most valuable things I had. Over time, the gap between perception and reality grew wider. In their world, I was still the same person who struggled to find direction. In mine, I had already found it and was moving forward with confidence. That contrast was almost surreal at times. Sitting at family gatherings, listening to them talk about me as if nothing had changed, while knowing how much had actually changed, created a quiet tension I carried with me. Despite everything, I never felt the need to correct them. It wasn't about hiding out of fear or insecurity. It was a deliberate choice. I wanted to reach a point where my success spoke for itself, where it couldn't be questioned or dismissed. Words would have been easy, but proof required time. And I was willing to wait. As my business continued to grow, I became more strategic in my decisions. I expanded carefully, making sure each move added value and stability. I learned to think long-term, to plan ahead, and to anticipate challenges before they appeared. The more I built, the more confident I became. Not in a loud or obvious way, but in a quiet, steady manner that didn't need validation. There were moments when I considered telling my parents, just to see their reaction, to watch their perception shift in real time. But each time I chose not to. It felt incomplete, like revealing something before it had fully taken shape. I didn't want a temporary reaction or a brief moment of surprise. I wanted something deeper, something that would force them to truly see me differently. By the time everything was firmly in place, I had already become comfortable with the silence. It was no longer something I questioned. It was part of the process, part of the journey that had shaped who I was. The success I had built wasn't just about money or status. It was about independence, resilience, and proving to myself that I was capable of more than anyone had believed. And as I looked ahead, knowing what I had achieved and what was still to come, there was a quiet certainty inside me that the moment of truth was approaching, whether they were ready for it or not. The restaurant my parents chose for dinner wasn't just expensive. It was the kind of place people talked about but rarely visited unless they had something to prove. When I saw the name in my mother's message, I paused for a moment, reading it twice to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. It didn't make sense. This wasn't the type of place my family would normally go to. Growing up, dinners out were simple, practical, and carefully planned around cost. Even on special occasions, my parents preferred modest restaurants where they felt comfortable and in control. This place was different. It was known for its luxury, its atmosphere, and its prices that made people think twice before ordering. As I got ready that evening, the thought stayed in the back of my mind. Why here? Why now? It wasn't like my parents to suddenly choose a high-end restaurant without a clear reason. My brother might have suggested it, I thought. He had always liked showing off, especially in places where appearances mattered. It would fit his personality perfectly to pick somewhere expensive just to create an image, to make it seem like everything in his life was polished and successful. But even then, something about it felt off. The closer I got to the restaurant, the more familiar everything became. The location, the exterior, the subtle details that most people wouldn't notice, all of it connected to something I knew very well. I slowed down slightly as I approached the entrance, taking a moment to observe the building from the outside. The lighting was warm and carefully designed, drawing attention without being overwhelming. The staff at the entrance stood with a quiet confidence, greeting guests with professionalism that felt effortless. It was exactly how it was supposed to be. Inside, the atmosphere was calm but refined. Soft music played in the background, just loud enough to fill the silence without interrupting conversations. The tables were arranged with precision, each one set to create a sense of privacy, while still maintaining the open feel of the space. Everything was intentional, from the placement of the chairs to the way the light reflected off the glass surfaces. I had spent months studying details like these, making decisions about how everything should look and feel. Seeing it all come together in real life, gave me a quiet sense of satisfaction. I walked further in, keeping my expression neutral, as if I were seeing it for the first time. That part wasn't difficult. I had practiced blending in, staying unnoticed, even in places that meant something to me. The host greeted me politely and asked for the reservation name. I gave it, and within seconds, I was directed toward the table where my family was already seated. As I followed, I noticed a few staff members glance in my direction, their expressions respectful but controlled. They knew who I was, but they also understood the importance of discretion. Nothing about their behavior gave anything away. When I reached the table, my family looked exactly as I expected. My father sat upright, scanning the menu with a serious expression, while my mother adjusted her posture as soon as she saw me, her face shifting into a polite but distant smile. My brother leaned back in his chair, relaxed and confident, as if he belonged there completely. The setting seemed to amplify his attitude, giving him even more reason to act like he was above everyone else. "Finally decided to show up," he said, his tone light but clearly meant to draw attention. I pulled out my chair and sat down without responding, placing my focus on the table in front of me. The menu was exactly as I remembered it, carefully designed to reflect the brand's identity, clean, elegant, and precise. I ran my fingers along the edge of it for a brief moment before opening it, scanning the options without really needing to. What struck me most wasn't the place itself, but the way my family interacted with it. They treated it like a stage, something to perform on rather than experience. My father ordered confidently, choosing the most expensive items without hesitation, as if the price itself was part of the appeal. My mother followed, adding dishes and drinks with a subtle glance around the room, making sure others could see. My brother joined in, suggesting extras, laughing loudly, drawing attention in small but deliberate ways. It became clear that this dinner wasn't just about food, it was about image, about proving something to themselves or to anyone who might be watching. They wanted to be seen in a place like this, to feel like they belonged in that world, even if it was just for a night. And in doing so, they completely overlooked the one thing that mattered most, the reality of how they had ended up there. As I sat there, watching everything unfold, I felt a strange mix of detachment and awareness. This place, this environment, this entire experience, it was all connected to me in ways they couldn't even imagine. Every detail they admired, every dish they ordered, every moment they enjoyed was part of something I had helped create. And yet, to them, I was still the same person they had always seen. I leaned back slightly in my chair, observing quietly as the evening began to take shape. The conversation started, the tone set, the familiar patterns beginning to emerge. Nothing about their behavior had changed, even in a setting that should have made them pause, reflect, or question. Instead, they leaned into it, embracing the illusion they had built for themselves. And as I watched them, knowing everything they didn't, I realized just how perfectly everything had aligned for what was about to happen. I arrived at the restaurant a few minutes after them, intentionally keeping my timing controlled rather than rushed. From the outside, I could already see them through the glass walls, seated comfortably at a corner table that gave them a full view of the entire dining area. My father was sitting straight with a serious expression, my mother adjusting her hair and outfit every few minutes as if she was preparing for a public appearance, and my brother leaning back casually, already acting like he owned the place. Even from a distance, their body language told me everything. They were in performance mode, completely unaware of how unnecessary it was. I paused for a moment before entering, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to observe. There is a strange clarity in watching people when they don't know they are being watched differently. They reveal themselves more honestly. My family, in that moment, was not just having dinner. They were constructing a story about themselves. A story of importance, success, and control. And I was the only one who knew how fragile that story really was. When I finally stepped inside, the atmosphere of the restaurant wrapped around me immediately. The soft lighting, the polished floors, the quiet hum of conversations. It all felt familiar in a way I couldn't ignore. The staff at the entrance greeted me with subtle recognition. Though they kept it professional, I gave a small nod in return, signaling that nothing special needed to be done. I didn't want attention. Not yet. As I walked toward the table, I became aware of small changes in my family's expressions. My mother was the first to notice me. Her eyes scanned me quickly from head to toe, and I could see a faint, almost automatic reaction of judgment. It wasn't harsh, just habitual. She always did that, as if measuring my presence against an invisible standard she had created long ago. My father followed, glancing up from the menu with a brief look that was difficult to read. My brother, however, reacted immediately and openly. He smirked the moment he saw me. It wasn't subtle. It was the kind of expression that didn't need explanation. He leaned slightly forward in his chair, tapping the table once, as if marking my arrival. "Still dressing like you're broke?" he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. A couple of people turned their heads briefly, then looked away. I didn't respond. I simply continued walking. That silence irritated him more than any response would have. I could see it in the way his smile tightened slightly, as if expecting a reaction that never came. My father didn't intervene. He rarely did in moments like this. My mother gave a soft, dismissive laugh, the kind she used when she wanted to agree without directly stating it. It was a familiar pattern, one I had experienced many times before. The roles were already set before I even reached the table. When I arrived, I pulled out the chair and sat down calmly. The leather was smooth, the table perfectly arranged, the lighting casting soft shadows across the polished surface. Everything around us was designed to feel refined, controlled, and intentional. Yet the dynamic at the table was anything but balanced. My brother immediately continued speaking, as if my arrival was just a brief interruption in his conversation. "You took your time," he said, glancing at me briefly before returning to his phone. "Some of us actually show up on time when we're invited." I was on time, I replied simply, placing my hands on the table. My answer didn't matter to him. It never really did. He continued talking, shifting the topic back to himself, his work, his plans, his version of success. My parents listened more attentively to him than to anything else. It was subtle, but clear. Their eyes followed his movements, their expressions reacting more to his tone than to his words. The waiter approached shortly after, offering water and taking initial drink orders. My father ordered confidently, without checking prices, choosing items that reflected comfort and familiarity with luxury, even though I knew it wasn't something he experienced often. My mother added a few suggestions, her tone careful but intentional, making sure her choices sounded refined. My brother ordered last, picking the most expensive items on the menu with a laugh, as if it was all part of a game. When it came to me, the waiter paused slightly, waiting. I closed the menu slowly and said I would decide later. It wasn't hesitation, it was control. I wanted to see how the evening unfolded before adding anything to it. As the drinks arrived and the conversation settled, the table slowly returned to its usual rhythm. My brother dominated most of it, speaking loudly, interrupting occasionally, and making jokes that only he found funny. My parents responded to him more than they did to me. I stayed mostly silent, observing, listening, noting every shift in tone and behavior. There was a predictability to it that I had grown used to over the years. Still, something felt slightly different that night. It wasn't obvious to them, but I could sense it. The environment, the restaurant, the timing, all of it felt aligned in a way that wasn't accidental. Every detail around us was part of a structure I understood better than they did, and they were sitting comfortably inside it without realizing it. My brother eventually leaned forward again, looking at me with that same familiar expression. "So, what are you actually doing these days?" he asked, louder than necessary. "Or are you still figuring life out?" My mother chuckled softly at the question, as if it was harmless. My father didn't stop eating. The question hung in the air for a moment, waiting for a response that I didn't feel pressured to give. I looked at him briefly, then leaned back slightly in my chair. And as the conversation continued around me, I realized that none of them had any idea how close they were sitting to the truth they had never bothered to see. My brother's comment landed at the table like it always did, loud, careless, and designed to sting. "Still figuring life out?" he repeated, this time with a small laugh, as if he had delivered something clever. My mother joined in softly, the kind of laugh that wasn't meant to be harsh, but somehow always felt worse because it confirmed agreement. My father didn't say anything, but his silence carried its own message, the kind I had learned to interpret over the years without needing explanation. I didn't react immediately. That was something I had trained myself to do. In the past, I used to respond, defend myself, explain things that never needed explaining to people who had already decided what they believed. But over time, I learned that reactions only fed the cycle. Silence, on the other hand, created space. And space made people uncomfortable in ways words never could. My brother leaned back in his chair, clearly expecting a reply. When none came, he smirked again and turned his attention back to the menu, as if I had already been dismissed from the conversation. My mother adjusted her glass and changed the subject slightly, but the tone remained the same. Everything at the table still revolved around him. It always did. The waiter returned to confirm drink preferences, breaking the moment just enough for the tension to fade slightly. My father ordered something expensive again, without hesitation, reinforcing the pattern that had already formed. My mother followed with a careful choice, ensuring it matched the tone she wanted to present. My brother added another item, joking about going all out tonight, as if the cost of the meal was part of the entertainment. Each order felt like another layer being added to a performance they didn't realize they were giving. When the waiter finally turned to me, there was a brief pause. I could sense the expectation in the air, subtle but present. I glanced at the menu again, though I already knew what I would choose. "Just water for now," I said calmly. My brother let out a short laugh. "Of course," he muttered, shaking his head. My mother gave a faint smile that suggested pity more than amusement. My father still didn't react. It was a small moment, but it fit perfectly into the pattern they had created for years. I was the one who didn't match their expectations, the one who always seemed slightly out of place in their version of success. As the drinks arrived and the table settled again, the conversation shifted back into familiar territory. My brother began talking about his work again, describing it in a way that made everything sound more important than it likely was. He exaggerated details, emphasized small achievements, and framed ordinary events as milestones. My parents listened closely, nodding at the right moments, reinforcing his narrative without question. I observed quietly, taking everything in without interruption. There was something predictable about it, almost rehearsed. It wasn't just conversation, it was structure. Each person had their role, and they played it consistently without realizing it. My brother was the achiever. My parents were the supporters, and I was the observer who was expected to remain in the background. At one point, my mother turned slightly toward me. "You should learn from him," she said gently, referring to my brother. "He knows how to take life seriously." The words were familiar. I had heard variations of them for years. They were never delivered with anger, just certainty. A belief so deeply ingrained that it no longer needed justification. My brother smiled faintly at her comment, clearly satisfied, while continuing to scroll through his phone. "I am serious," I said quietly, not looking up. My father finally glanced in my direction, but his expression remained unchanged. "Being serious doesn't show results," he replied simply, then returned to his food. That was the end of it. No discussion, no curiosity, just another statement absorbed into the structure of their belief system. I nodded slightly, not because I agreed, but because I understood there was no point in continuing. As the appetizers arrived, the table shifted again into small talk. My brother made jokes about the restaurant, pointing out expensive items on the menu, and exaggerating how much everything cost. My mother laughed again, more comfortably now, as if the earlier tension had dissolved. My father commented on the quality of the place, impressed but reserved, trying not to appear too unfamiliar with the environment. I noticed how easily they adapted to the setting, how quickly they accepted it as part of their reality for the evening. None of them questioned how they were there or what it meant. They simply enjoyed it, as most people would. But for me, every detail carried a different weight. Every plate that arrived, every order that was placed, every interaction with the staff, all of it, connected to something deeper that they couldn't see. My brother eventually looked at me again, this time with a more direct tone. "You know," he said, "you should stop waiting around and actually do something with your life." It wasn't the first time he had said something like that, and it wouldn't be the last. But something about the way he said it that night felt slightly different, more confident, more dismissive, like he believed it more than usual. I looked at him briefly, then at the table, then at the people sitting around it. None of them were paying attention in the same way I was. None of them saw the layers beneath what was happening. They saw a dinner. I saw something else entirely beginning to unfold. Something they were still too comfortable to notice as the evening slowly continued without interruption. The table looked perfectly normal from the outside. But the longer I stayed seated, the more I noticed how carefully everything was being controlled by habit rather than awareness. My father sat in his usual posture, straight-backed and composed, as if the way he held himself reflected authority. My mother kept adjusting small things, her glass, her napkin, her hair subtle gestures that revealed she was more focused on appearance than comfort. My brother, on the other hand, acted like the entire evening was his stage, constantly shifting between speaking, laughing, and checking his phone as if he was managing a performance only he could see. The appetizers had just been placed on the table, and the staff moved with quiet precision, avoiding unnecessary interruption. The restaurant had a rhythm of its own, one that my family seemed to enjoy without understanding it. Every plate was placed carefully, every movement calculated, and every detail designed to maintain a sense of effortless luxury. But what they didn't realize was how much control actually existed behind that illusion of ease. My father reached for his drink first, taking a slow sip while scanning the room. He always did that in places like this, as if trying to measure how much he belonged. My mother followed shortly after, tasting her food with small, deliberate bites, nodding slightly as if confirming that the experience met her expectations. My brother, however, didn't wait. He immediately started commenting on the food, comparing it to other restaurants, exaggerating his opinions in a way that drew attention back to him. "This is decent," he said loudly, cutting into a piece of food with unnecessary force. "Not the best I've had, but acceptable." No one asked for his review, but he gave it anyway. That was always his way, turning simple moments into opportunities to present himself as someone experienced, someone whose opinion mattered. My parents responded with polite agreement, reinforcing his words without question. It wasn't discussion, it was reinforcement. I stayed quiet, observing how quickly the conversation adjusted itself around him. Even without effort, he naturally became the center of attention at the table. It wasn't because he was more important, but because the family had been trained to respond to him that way over the years. Patterns like that don't form overnight, you build slowly, through repetition, until no one questions them anymore. The main course hadn't arrived yet, but my brother was already leaning into the idea of ordering more. He waved at the waiter slightly and began pointing at items on the menu again, speaking as if he was making decisions for everyone. "We should try that," he said, tapping a section of the menu without looking at anyone else. "And that one too. Might as well enjoy it properly." My father gave a short nod, not fully agreeing but not stopping him either. My mother added a small suggestion, careful and soft, making sure her input sounded reasonable rather than demanding. The waiter wrote everything down without expression, trained to handle situations where customers ordered without considering limits. I noticed something interesting in that moment. No one at the table asked about cost. Not directly, not even indirectly. It wasn't because they didn't care, it was because they assumed they didn't need to. That assumption alone revealed more than anything they said out loud. They were comfortable ordering freely in a place that didn't match their usual environment, as if they had already convinced themselves they belonged there. The food arrived gradually, each dish placed with the same level of care. My brother immediately reacted again, pointing out presentation, ingredients, and portions as if he had expertise. My mother tried a bite of something new and smiled slightly, approving without fully committing to praise. My father remained focused on his plate, eating slowly, occasionally glancing around the restaurant. Then came a brief pause in the conversation, one of those rare moments when no one at the table was speaking. It was during that silence that I noticed something subtle shift in my brother's expression. He leaned slightly forward, setting his fork down with a small clink, and looked directly at me. "So," he said casually at first, then more clearly, "what are you actually doing these days?" It wasn't a question born out of curiosity. It was framed in a way that suggested conclusion rather than inquiry, as if the answer was already known and just needed confirmation. My mother glanced toward me briefly, then back at her plate. My father didn't react immediately, continuing to eat as if the question didn't require his attention. My brother tilted his head slightly and added, "Or are you still in that phase where you're figuring things out?" That word again, figuring. It always came up when they talked about me. It was a label they had assigned long ago, one that had never been updated regardless of reality. I could feel the weight of it sitting between us, not because it was true, but because they believed it was. The waiter passed by again, refilling glasses silently, creating a brief distraction, but the question still hung in the air. My brother waited for a response, his expression relaxed but expectant. My mother gave a small, polite smile, as if preparing for something predictable. My father finally looked up, briefly acknowledging the moment before returning to his plate. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked at each of them one by one, noticing how certain they were in their assumptions. The table was still full of food, conversations, and movement. But in that moment, something beneath it all felt unusually still. Not because anything had changed externally, but because I understood something they still hadn't realized about what was sitting in front of them, and how little of the truth they were actually aware of while the dinner continued unfolding around us. My brother's question didn't come from curiosity. It came from certainty. The kind of certainty people develop when they believe they already know the answer and are just waiting for it to be confirmed. "What are you actually doing these days?" he had asked earlier, but now he leaned into it more, as if repeating it would force reality to align with his assumption. The way he said it made it clear that, in his mind, my life was still stuck in pause while everyone else had moved forward. I looked at him without reacting immediately. Around the table, the atmosphere stayed casual. My mother was quietly eating, pretending not to pay attention, but clearly listening. My father was still focused on his plate, though his ears were tuned in, as they always were when conversations turned toward me. My brother, however, was fully engaged, waiting for an answer that would reinforce the version of me he had carried for years. He smiled slightly and added, "Still trying different things, right? Nothing stable yet?" His tone carried a mix of amusement and superiority, like he was explaining my life to the table rather than asking about it. A couple of nearby diners laughed softly at something unrelated, and that background sound made the moment feel even more detached, like we were sitting in two different realities at the same table. My mother finally looked up and gave a small, almost sympathetic smile. "Everyone finds their way at their own pace," she said gently. But the way she said it wasn't comforting. It sounded like an explanation for delay, not recognition of progress. My father didn't add anything. His silence, as always, felt like quiet agreement. I could feel the structure of the conversation forming again. My brother was the benchmark, the success story. My parents were the supporters of that story. And I was the contrast that made it all easier to define. It wasn't something they consciously planned, but it had become automatic over the years. Every dinner, every conversation, every comparison followed the same pattern. My brother leaned back in his chair, clearly satisfied that the question had been asked in a way that supported his perspective. He picked up his glass, took a slow sip, and glanced at me again. "You should really settle on something soon," he said casually, like advice. "At some point, you need direction." There it was again, direction. A word they always used as if I had none, as if movement without their approval didn't count as progress. I noticed how easily he placed himself in a position of guidance, even though he had never asked about anything I was actually doing. To him, my life was an unfinished story. He didn't need to read carefully because he already assumed the ending. The waiter arrived again to clear a plate and check if everything was fine. My mother responded politely, thanking him. My father nodded slightly. My brother barely acknowledged him, still focused on the conversation at the table. I stayed quiet, watching the exchange, noticing how easily service, attention, and hierarchy blended in places like this. Everything looked equal on the surface, but behavior revealed something different. When the waiter left, my brother leaned forward again, lowering his voice slightly, but not enough to make it private. "I'm just saying," he continued, "life doesn't wait for you. At some point, you either make it or you don't." My mother nodded again, softly agreeing. "He's right," she added, not looking directly at me this time. My father gave a brief hum of acknowledgement, still not fully engaging, but not opposing either. That was the pattern: agreement without conversation, assumption without verification. I could feel the familiar weight of it all pressing into the space between us. Not anger, not frustration, something quieter, something more controlled. It wasn't new. It had been happening for years, in different forms, at different tables, and different settings. But the setting tonight made it feel sharper, because everything around us was built on success, appearance, and value. And none of them had any idea how misplaced their assumptions were in a place like this. My brother continued, almost enjoying the sound of his own voice now. "Some people just stay stuck," he said, gesturing slightly with his fork. "They keep trying things, but never really go anywhere." This time, a faint smile appeared on his face, as if he had delivered a final conclusion. My mother gave a small laugh, more out of habit than humor. My father finally looked up again briefly, then returned to his food. No one questioned the statement, no one challenged it. It settled naturally into the conversation like it belonged there. I glanced around the table again. The food, the lighting, the staff moving quietly in the background, all of it felt consistent, structured, carefully maintained. Yet the conversation at our table was anything but stable. It was built entirely on assumptions, none of which had been tested against reality. My brother leaned back once more, clearly satisfied with how the moment had unfolded. He looked at me again, expecting either silence or agreement, both of which served his version of the story equally well. And as I sat there, listening to everything they believed about me being repeated without hesitation, I understood just how far their version of my life had drifted from what was actually true. While the dinner continued around us without any of them realizing it, I didn't respond to my brother right away. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I had learned that rushing to correct people who are committed to misunderstanding you is pointless. My silence wasn't uncertainty. It was control. Around the table, they mistook it for what they always had: lack of direction, hesitation, or inability to defend myself. In reality, it was the opposite. I was simply choosing not to play a game they didn't realize I had already outgrown. My brother noticed the silence and leaned back slightly, smiling to himself as if it confirmed everything he believed. "Exactly," he said casually, turning his attention back to his plate. No answer as usual. My mother gave a soft, almost automatic laugh, the kind that filled space rather than meaning anything. My father remained quiet, focused on his food, but his silence carried the same weight it always did: acceptance without inquiry. I looked down at my glass of water. It was simple, untouched since it arrived. Around me the table continued moving. Forks clinked softly against plates. A waiter passed behind us, refilling another table's drinks with quiet precision. The restaurant was alive with activity, but our table felt strangely isolated, like a small island where the same conversations had been repeating for years. My brother began talking again almost immediately, shifting effortlessly back into his usual rhythm. He spoke about work, about people he knew, about opportunities he claimed were coming his way. His words were confident, structured, and designed to impress. My parents followed along easily, responding at the right moments, nodding, smiling, reinforcing everything he said without question. It was familiar, predictable, almost mechanical. I sat back slightly in my chair and observed them. Not in anger, not in frustration, but with clarity. There is a difference between being part of a conversation and watching one unfold from the outside while sitting inside it. That night, I felt like the second. Every sentence they exchanged built a version of reality that I no longer belonged to, yet I was still physically present in it. My brother laughed at something he said and then turned slightly toward me again. "You should stop overthinking things," he added casually. "Sometimes you just need to accept where you are and move on." That line might have sounded like advice to someone else, but to me, it was repetition, a variation of every assumption he had made about my life for years. My mother nodded gently, as if agreeing with wisdom. My father gave a small approving sound without looking up. None of them questioned the foundation of what was being said. They never did. I could feel something different in me at that moment. Not emotional, but observational. It was like stepping slightly outside the conversation while still sitting in it. I noticed how easily they reinforced each other's beliefs. My brother would speak, my parents would validate, and the idea would solidify without resistance. There was no space for contradiction, because no one in that cycle was looking for truth, only familiarity. My brother continued, enjoying the flow of attention. "People like you get stuck, because they keep waiting for the perfect moment," he said. "But life doesn't work like that." He leaned forward slightly, emphasizing his point, as if he was teaching something important. My mother nodded again, this time more deliberately. My father finally looked up for a brief moment, then returned to his plate without comment. The pattern was complete. Statement, agreement, silence. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct him. I simply watched. There was something revealing about how confidently people speak about lives they haven't bothered to understand. It creates a kind of illusion where repetition replaces truth. If something is said often enough in the same room, it starts to feel real to everyone inside it. My brother wiped his mouth with a napkin and glanced at me again. "You're quiet tonight," he said. "That's usually not a good sign." A faint smile crossed his face, like he had found another piece of evidence to support his narrative. My mother looked at me briefly, this time with mild concern mixed with expectation, as if silence itself was a symptom. My father didn't react at all. Silence, in their language, always meant the same thing: lack of progress, lack of certainty, lack of direction. I stayed quiet for a moment longer, letting the assumption settle, letting them feel comfortable in it. There was no need to interrupt, no need to correct. Every word they spoke added clarity, not confusion. And clarity was something I valued far more than validation. Around us, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm. Plates were cleared and replaced. Conversations at nearby tables rose and fell in soft waves. The environment remained unchanged, elegant and controlled. But at our tables, something invisible had formed a structure built entirely on perception rather than reality. My brother leaned back again, satisfied with the direction of the conversation. My parents returned to their food, comfortable in the version of events they believed. And I remained there, still, silent and aware, understanding more in those few moments than anything they had said throughout the entire dinner, while the evening continued unfolding exactly the way they thought it always would. The silence I kept at the table wasn't accidental anymore. It had become intentional, almost structured, like a boundary I was maintaining without needing to announce it. My family, however, interpreted it in the only way they had ever known how to interpret me: through limitation. To them, silence meant absence of progress, absence of confidence, absence of direction. They never considered that silence could also mean observation, control, or awareness beyond what they were willing to see. My brother, still comfortable in his role as the center of attention, filled the gap I left behind without hesitation. He spoke more freely now, as if my lack of response had cleared space for him to expand further. "You see," he said at one point, leaning slightly forward. "This is what I mean. People either keep moving or they just stay stuck watching others move." His tone carried satisfaction, like he was explaining a simple truth to people who already agreed with him. My mother nodded immediately, reinforcing his statement without question. My father gave a small approving glance, continuing to eat as if the conversation was already resolved. I didn't react. I simply observed how easily the narrative shaped itself around me without my participation. There was something revealing in how quickly they filled silence with their own interpretation. No space was left for uncertainty. Everything had to mean something, and in their version of events, it always meant the same thing when it came to me. The restaurant around us continued its steady rhythm. Waiters moved between tables with quiet precision, carrying plates that looked carefully arranged and intentional. The soft lighting reflected off polished surfaces, giving everything a controlled elegance. At other tables, conversations flowed normally louder. Discussion, small gestures of connection. But at ours, the flow was different. It was structured, repetitive, almost rehearsed in its own way. My brother adjusted his posture again, clearly enjoying the attention he had. He began talking about future plans, describing opportunities in a way that made them sound inevitable rather than uncertain. "Things are moving fast for me right now," he said confidently. "It's just a matter of time before everything falls into place." My mother responded with pride in her voice, as if she was hearing confirmation of something she had always believed. My father gave a brief nod, the kind that didn't require thought, only agreement. I noticed how easily ambition turned into certainty in his speech, even when there was no proof behind it. It wasn't unusual. He had always spoken this way, turning potential into achievement before it had even happened, and my parents had always accepted it without question, reinforcing it through repetition and attention. At one point, my brother turned slightly toward me again, as if remembering I was still part of the table. "You should really think more seriously about your direction," he said, his tone shifting into advice again. "Time doesn't wait." My mother gave a soft, agreeing sound, and my father continued eating without interruption. The statement hung briefly in the air, but no one expected a response. They had already decided what my silence meant. Anything I said would have simply been filtered through that assumption anyway. I looked at him for a moment, but said nothing. Not out of inability, but because I understood something about conversations like this. They weren't built for exchange. They were built for reinforcement. Every sentence was designed to confirm what they already believed, not to explore what was true. My brother smiled slightly, as if my silence again validated his point. "Exactly," he added, interpreting it in his own way. "That's what I'm talking about." The confidence in his voice was steady, almost rehearsed. He had no doubt about his interpretation of the world around him, and even less doubt about his interpretation of me. That certainty gave him comfort. It allowed him to place everything into categories that felt simple and stable. My mother reached for her glass and took a small sip, then looked toward me briefly. "You've always been quiet," she said gently. But there was an underlying tone of concern mixed with assumption. Not curiosity, just classification. As if my silence had always been a fixed trait rather than a choice. "Yes," my brother added quickly, seizing the moment. "He's always been like that. Not very expressive. That's probably why things move slowly." He said it lightly, but it carried weight. My father finally looked up for a second, offering a faint expression that suggested agreement without engagement. Then he returned to his plate, closing the moment without further thought. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the conversation continue without me. There was no need to interrupt it. Each sentence they spoke only reinforced the structure they had built over years. I was not part of their discussion. I was part of their conclusion. The waiter returned again, clearing empty plates and asking politely if anything else was needed. My mother responded warmly, thanking him. My brother barely acknowledged his presence. My father gave a brief nod. I stayed quiet, watching the interaction, noticing how differently respect, attention, and acknowledgement were distributed even in the smallest moments. When the waiter left, my brother resumed speaking as if nothing had paused. "Anyway," he said, "the important thing is momentum. Once you have it, everything else follows." My mother smiled in agreement again. My father gave another small nod. The sentence settled into the table-like fact, unquestioned and complete. I didn't challenge it. I didn't correct it. I simply observed how easily people build certainty from repetition, how quickly assumptions turn into truth when no one interrupts them. While the dinner continued around us with every person at the table convinced they understood far more than they actually did, the moment the waiter appeared again, the tone at the table shifted slightly, even if no one acknowledged it directly. It was subtle, almost invisible, but noticeable if you were paying attention. He moved with quiet professionalism, collecting empty plates and replacing them with clean ones, asking polite questions that my family answered with increasing confidence. My mother smiled more when speaking to him. My father gave short, composed responses, and my brother barely looked up, as if staff presence was just part of the background environment, rather than people doing their job. I noticed something interesting in the way the waiter reacted to me, specifically. It wasn't obvious to the others at the table, but there was a slight change in his attention whenever he came near. Not nervousness, not hesitation, recognition. Controlled recognition. The kind that comes from understanding more than you are allowed to show. He didn't overreact, didn't stare, didn't break professionalism. But there was awareness in the way he positioned himself, the way he paused just slightly longer when passing behind my chair, the way his eyes briefly met mine before shifting away. My family, of course, didn't notice any of this. They were too occupied with their own conversation, too comfortable in the assumption that everything around them existed independently of them. My brother continued speaking, now moving into a different topic, shifting from his career talk to casual commentary about the restaurant itself. He commented on the decor, the lighting, the atmosphere, as if evaluating it from a position of authority. "This place is actually decent," he said, leaning back slightly. "They've done a good job with the presentation." My mother nodded in agreement, glancing around the room approvingly. My father added a brief comment about the quality of the service. It was a conversation built on perception rather than understanding. They were consumers of the environment, not connected to it in any deeper way. That separation was something I observed quietly, without interrupting. The waiter returned again to refill water glasses. As he leaned closer to our table, there was a brief pause when he reached my side. It lasted only a second, maybe less, but it was enough for me to notice the difference. His movement slowed just slightly, as if confirming something internally before continuing. My brother was still talking at that moment, completely unaware. My mother was adjusting her napkin. My father was looking toward the other side of the room. When the waiter finished, he stepped back and offered a polite nod to the table. "Everything is fine, sir?" he asked generally. My father responded with a short, "Yes." My mother added a soft thank you. My brother gave a distracted nod without looking up. Then the waiter turned slightly toward me again, just briefly, before moving away. That small moment stood out more than anything else happening at the table. Not because it was dramatic, but because it contrasted so sharply with everything else. My family saw service. I saw awareness. They saw staff doing their job. I saw controlled recognition layered beneath professionalism. My brother eventually noticed the change in attention direction and leaned forward slightly again. "You're very quiet tonight," he said almost teasingly. "Is everything okay?" It was framed like concern, but the undertone was familiar interpretation. My silence was always something they tried to label. My mother looked toward me briefly, her expression mild but expectant, as if waiting for reassurance that nothing was wrong. My father didn't interrupt, but I could feel his attention shift slightly toward me for the first time in a while. "I'm fine," I said simply. My answer didn't change the mood at the table. It never did. My brother accepted it immediately, but not seriously. My mother nodded once and returned to her food. My father gave a small, almost automatic acknowledgement and continued eating. The conversation resumed its usual flow as if the question had only been a formality. But something about the moment felt different from earlier exchanges. It wasn't what was said, it was how unnecessary the question actually was to them. They didn't ask because they genuinely wondered. They asked because silence required interpretation, and interpretation always had to fit their existing framework. My brother shifted again, this time clearly enjoying his own presence in the conversation. "You know," he said, "people can usually tell when someone is struggling. It shows in how they act." My mother made a small agreeing sound. My father didn't respond. but his silence leaned toward acceptance. The statement wasn't directed at me directly, but it didn't need to be. It was placed into the space in a way that naturally included me without naming me. I watched him as he spoke, noticing how confident he was in his assumptions. There was no doubt in his voice, no hesitation. Everything he believed about people, success, and struggle had already been decided long before this dinner. I was simply a reference point for those beliefs, not someone whose reality needed to be understood. The waiter returned once more, this time bringing additional items to another table nearby. As he passed us, I noticed again that subtle shift in his awareness. It was almost imperceptible, but consistent. He moved slightly more carefully around my side of the table, as if aware of a boundary that didn't exist for anyone else sitting there. My family remained unaware of all of it. They continued their conversation, comfortable in their version of the evening, comfortable in their interpretation of me, comfortable in the roles they had assigned without question. And I stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was beginning to understand how much more was being revealed in the things they never noticed, while the dinner quietly continued unfolding around us without interruption. The conversation at the table continued in its usual rhythm, but something had shifted in how I was observing it. It wasn't about what was being said anymore, it was about what was being assumed without evidence. My brother kept speaking with confidence, my parents kept responding with agreement, and I kept noticing the structure underneath every sentence. The more they talked, the clearer it became that their version of reality was built entirely on outdated information about me, preserved through repetition rather than updated through truth. My brother leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table as he spoke. "You know," he said, "at some point, people either succeed or they don't. It's not complicated." He said it casually, like it was a universal law rather than a personal opinion. My mother nodded gently, as if it was wisdom worth accepting without question. My father gave a small approving sound, still focused on his plate, but still participating in agreement. I listened without reacting, not because I lacked a response, but because I was beginning to understand how unnecessary responses were in a conversation where conclusions were already decided in advance. My presence at the table didn't change their beliefs, and their beliefs didn't reflect my reality. The two were functioning independently, side by side, without ever intersecting in a meaningful way. The waiter came by again, this time bringing a new round of dishes for another table nearby. As he passed us, I noticed the same subtle behavior from earlier, the slight adjustment in his movement, the brief moment of awareness in his expression when he was near my side of the table. It was controlled, professional, but consistent enough to be noticeable if you were paying attention. My family, however, remained completely unaware. They were still focused on their conversation, still locked into their interpretation of everything around them. My brother continued speaking, now shifting topics slightly. "People like us," he said, emphasizing the phrase as if it naturally included everyone at the table except me. "We understand timing. That's what makes the difference." My mother smiled faintly at his words. "That's true," she said softly, reinforcing the idea without examining it. My father gave another brief nod, his agreement habitual rather than reflective. It was a pattern I had seen repeatedly throughout the evening. Statement, reinforcement, closure. No questions, no contradictions, no space for anything outside the established narrative. I took a slow sip of water, not because I needed it, but because it gave me a moment to observe without interruption. The restaurant around us remained calm and structured. Conversations at other tables rose and fell in soft waves. Waiters moved with precision, and the environment maintained its quiet sense of controlled elegance. Everything functioned smoothly, except for the invisible disconnect happening at our table. My brother glanced at me again, this time with a slightly more direct expression. "You're really not saying much tonight," he observed. "That's unusual for you." It wasn't curiosity, it was measurement. He was comparing my silence against his expectation of who I was supposed to be. My mother also looked toward me briefly, her expression mild but uncertain, as if trying to interpret something that didn't fit her usual understanding. My father remained silent, but his attention had clearly shifted in my direction again. "I'm just listening," I said calmly. My response was simple, but it didn't fit into their framework. My brother gave a short laugh. "Listening to what, exactly?" he asked, almost amused. "Nothing's really changed here." My mother smiled faintly again, as if agreeing that there was nothing significant to listen to. My father continued eating, not engaging further. But what my brother said unintentionally revealed something important. His belief that nothing had changed meant he assumed he already understood everything worth knowing. The waiter passed again, placing items at a nearby table. As he moved past us, I noticed a brief pause in his pace again, almost imperceptible. His awareness wasn't disruptive, but it was consistent. It wasn't something he acknowledged outwardly, but it existed in the way he moved, the way he positioned himself, the way he avoided unnecessary attention while still maintaining awareness of my presence. My family, meanwhile, continued building their narrative. My brother spoke about success as if it were a linear path that everyone followed at the same pace. "At a certain point," he said, "you just know where you stand in life." My mother nodded again, clearly agreeing. My father gave a quiet sound of approval. No one questioned the assumption behind the statement that positions in life were fixed, obvious, and visible to everyone at all times. It was a comforting belief for them, one that didn't require deeper examination. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the conversation continue without me. There was no urgency in correcting anything. No need to interrupt their certainty. What they didn't realize was that every assumption they were making about my position, my progress, and my direction was already outdated. Not slightly wrong, completely disconnected from what was actually true. The waiter returned once more, this time briefly meeting my gaze before continuing on. It was subtle, controlled, and unnoticed by everyone else at the table. But in that brief moment, there was acknowledgement not of importance, but of awareness. And as the dinner continued flowing around us, I remained silent, observing how confidently they continued speaking about things they had never actually taken the time to understand, while the evening moved forward, without them realizing how misaligned their assumptions had already become. The conversation at the table slowly drifted away from me again, as it always did, returning to the comfort of familiar topics where my presence didn't disrupt their narrative. My brother resumed speaking about himself, my parents followed his lead, and the rhythm of the dinner settled back into its usual structure. But something in me had already shifted. I wasn't just sitting at the table anymore. I was studying it, quietly mapping how every assumption they made connected back to a version of reality that no longer existed. My brother leaned back in his chair, clearly satisfied with how the conversation had unfolded so far. "Honestly," he said, "a lot of people just don't know how to build anything meaningful. They keep trying different things, but never commit." My mother nodded softly, agreeing without hesitation. My father gave a small approving sound again, as if reinforcing a statement that required no evaluation. It was at that moment I noticed something different in the way I was processing everything. Their words no longer felt like attacks or comparisons. They felt like observations from a distance, disconnected from truth. I had spent years reacting internally to statements like these, but now there was a strange clarity in not reacting at all. It wasn't emotional detachment, it was recognition of how deeply their understanding of me was frozen in time. The waiter returned again, clearing a few plates from the table. As he moved, I noticed the same subtle behavior I had been observing throughout the evening. A slight pause near my side, a brief moment of attention that wasn't obvious enough for anyone else to notice. It wasn't service-related hesitation. It was something more like awareness without expression. He understood something he was not showing, and I understood that he understood. That silent recognition passed between us without disrupting the professionalism of his movements. My family, of course, noticed none of it. My brother continued speaking, now shifting the topic again. "The real difference between people," he said, "is discipline. Either you have it or you don't." He spoke with certainty, like it was a principle he had discovered rather than a simplified belief he had repeated often enough to accept as truth. My mother smiled faintly, as if approving the idea. "That's very true," she said gently. My father nodded again, still eating, still disengaged from anything that required deeper thought. The structure of their agreement was effortless. No debate, no challenge, just reinforcement. I remained quiet, but my awareness of the situation was becoming sharper. The conversation wasn't evolving, it was looping. Each statement built on assumptions that had never been tested, only repeated. My brother spoke as if experience automatically created wisdom. My parents accepted it as guidance, and together they formed a closed system where nothing outside it could enter. At one point, my brother turned slightly toward me again, as if remembering I was still part of the table. "You should think more seriously about structure," he said. "Without it, nothing lasts." My mother added a soft agreement. "He's right," she said without looking at me directly this time. My father gave another brief nod. It was the same pattern again: statement, reinforcement, closure. No curiosity, no question. Just assumption, layered on assumption. But something in the way he said it triggered a different awareness in me. Not emotional response, but structural clarity. They were not actually engaging with me. They were engaging with a version of me they had constructed years ago and never updated. That version still needed guidance, still lacked direction, still required comparison. In their minds, nothing had changed because they had never looked closely enough to notice that it had. The waiter returned again, placing a new item on a nearby table. As he passed us, I caught the same brief moment of awareness in his movement. It was subtle, but consistent. He wasn't reacting to the conversation or the atmosphere. He was reacting to something specific he had already registered. But he maintained control, offering no visible indication of when he understood. My brother, still unaware of anything beyond the table, continued confidently. "People overcomplicate things," he said. "Success is actually simple. You just have to stay consistent." My mother smiled again, agreeing without hesitation. My father gave a quiet acknowledgement. No one questioned what success meant, or who defined it, or whether their definition matched reality. It was accepted as something obvious, something already understood. I looked around the table slowly, taking in each of them one by one. My brother, confident in ideas that had never been tested beyond his own experience. My mother, supportive without questioning. My father, present but disengaged from deeper analysis. Together, they formed a stable structure of belief that didn't require external validation because it never challenged itself in the first place. And then I realized something even more important. This entire conversation, this entire dinner, this entire dynamic. They were all operating on information that I had already outgrown. Not slightly outdated, but completely disconnected from the present version of my life. My brother's voice pulled me back again. "Anyway," he said, leaning back once more. "As long as you keep figuring things out, I guess that's what matters for you right now." He said it casually, almost dismissively, as if summarizing my entire existence in a single phrase. My mother gave a soft, agreeing smile. My father didn't react beyond a small movement of acknowledgement. And in that moment, as their assumptions settled comfortably around the table once again, I understood something clearly: none of them were actually seeing me at all, while the dinner continued flowing forward without them realizing how far behind their understanding had already fallen. The dinner had reached a stage where the food no longer mattered as much as the behavior around it. Plates were being replaced, drinks refilled, and the table slowly filled with more expensive items than anyone had initially planned. My brother had taken control of that flow without officially deciding anything. He simply suggested, pointed, and assumed, and somehow the rest of the table adjusted around him without resistance. My father, who usually stayed careful about spending, seemed unusually relaxed that night. He ordered without checking prices, relying more on instinct than caution. My mother followed the same pattern, choosing dishes that sounded refined rather than practical, as if the setting itself justified the decisions. My brother, of course, treated it like entertainment. Every new order became another small performance of confidence, another way to show that limits did not apply to him. "Let's just enjoy it properly," he said at one point, leaning back with a satisfied expression. "No point holding back in a place like this." My mother smiled and agreed softly, as if the idea itself was reasonable and responsible. My father gave a small nod, not questioning it, and I sat there observing how quickly enjoyment had replaced any awareness of cost or consequence. It wasn't just about food anymore. It was about the feeling of belonging to a space they rarely entered and wanting to fully experience it while they could. The waiter moved efficiently between tables, and each time he approached ours, I noticed the same subtle shift in awareness. It was controlled and professional, but present. He did not behave differently in an obvious way, yet there was a level of attention that extended slightly beyond normal service. It was as if he understood more than he was allowed to acknowledge. My family, however, interpreted his professionalism as standard hospitality, nothing more. My brother continued talking, now shifting into a discussion about lifestyle. "The way I see it," he said, cutting into his food confidently, "you either live properly or you don't. There's no reason to hold back when you've worked for it." My mother nodded again, clearly influenced by his tone more than the content. My father added a brief agreement, still focused on eating. The conversation moved smoothly in the direction my brother guided, without interruption or challenge. I remained quiet, watching how easily decisions were being made without hesitation. No one at the table questioned the growing number of dishes. No one paused to calculate anything. Every choice felt justified simply because it was being made in an environment that looked expensive enough to support it. That illusion of setting often replaced actual awareness. At one point, my brother leaned slightly forward and gestured toward the menu again. "We should try that as well," he said, pointing at another section. "We're already here, might as well experience everything." My mother gave a small approving sound. My father didn't object. The waiter arrived shortly after, and without much discussion, the additional items were added. The process was smooth, almost automatic. There was no friction and decision-making, only flow. What stood out to me was not the ordering itself, but the assumption behind it. There was an unspoken belief that everything at this table existed within their comfort zone, that nothing here would require reconsideration later. That belief shaped every action they took. It was not confidence based on knowledge, but confidence based on perception. My brother, sensing control over the situation, became more expressive. "This is how it should be," he said. "No stress, no overthinking. Just enjoy the moment." My mother smiled again, as if the moment itself validated his philosophy. My father gave another quiet nod, reinforcing the same idea. The table had effectively aligned around a single perspective, one that prioritized immediate experience over reflection. I looked at the surroundings again. The restaurant was calm, structured, and designed for exactly this kind of illusion. Soft lighting, quiet service, carefully arranged tables, all of it contributed to a feeling of ease. But ease in such environments often hides complexity behind it. Nothing here was accidental, including the attention being paid to us. The waiter returned with another round of drinks, and again I noticed his brief, controlled awareness near my side of the table. It was not disruptive, but consistent enough to form a pattern. He wasn't reacting to my family's behavior. He was reacting to something else he recognized but chose not to express. That silence within professionalism stood out more than any conversation at the table. My brother continued speaking, now more confidently. "People worry too much about limits," he said. "Most of them don't realize how much is actually possible when you stop holding back." My mother nodded in agreement, and my father gave a brief approving sound again. The statement was accepted without examination, as most of his statements were. No one questioned what possible meant, or what holding back referred to. The words simply fit into their existing understanding of him. Meanwhile, the table had accumulated more dishes than anyone had initially planned. The surface was filled with plates, glasses, and small empty spaces that were quickly being replaced with new items. The progression was steady, almost invisible in how naturally it had escalated. I could see how easily perception guided behavior here. Because the environment looked luxurious, every decision inside it felt justified. Because my brother spoke with confidence, his choices felt correct. Because my parents wanted to match the moment, they followed without hesitation. And yet, None of them were aware of the structure behind what was happening. None of them were aware of how quickly small decisions were building into something larger. They were still operating under the assumption that everything at this table was within familiar limits. I stayed silent, not because I was unsure, but because I was observing something they had not yet recognized. The dinner was no longer just a meal. It had become a reflection of belief, assumption, and misplaced confidence, while the evening continued unfolding without any of them realizing how far their perception had already drifted from reality. The evening had settled into a comfortable rhythm for everyone at the table, except me. Plates were nearly full, conversation was flowing more freely, and the atmosphere had shifted from cautious ordering to complete indulgence. My brother seemed to enjoy that shift the most. He leaned back in his chair with confidence, speaking as if the entire experience belonged to him, as if he had personally created the environment we were sitting in. At one point, my mother reached for her glass and glanced around the restaurant with quiet admiration. "It really is beautiful here," she said softly, as if trying to justify the choices being made. My father gave a brief nod, still calm, still detached from any concern about the growing total of the bill. My brother, however, took her comment as encouragement. "Exactly," he replied immediately. "Places like this exist to be enjoyed. There's no point in overthinking it." He spoke with such certainty that it almost sounded logical. My mother smiled faintly, agreeing without hesitation. My father continued eating, unconcerned, and I remained silent, watching how easily comfort was replacing awareness. The more relaxed they became, the more freely they ordered, and the more disconnected they were from the consequences of those choices. The waiter arrived again, this time bringing additional items that had been requested earlier. Each placement on the table added to the growing collection of dishes, glasses, and small plates that no one seemed to fully track anymore. The table was no longer just a dining space. It had become a display of unchecked assumption. My brother gestured lightly toward the new dishes. "We should try more of this," he said. "We're here, after all." There was no hesitation in his voice, no sense of limitation. My mother nodded again, softly encouraging the idea. My father gave a small approving sound. Each of them participated in the expansion of the meal without questioning its direction. I noticed something subtle in the way the waiter moved around our table. He maintained professionalism, but there was a careful awareness in his positioning. He didn't rush, he didn't interrupt, but he was observant in a way that suggested he understood more than he expressed. My family, however, remained completely unaware of anything beyond their immediate experience. My brother continued speaking, now shifting into a more personal tone. "You know," he said, "it feels good when you don't have to worry about small things like this. That's the real freedom." My mother smiled gently. "Yes," she agreed, as if agreeing with something meaningful. My father gave another brief nod. The idea settled into the conversation without resistance, as if it belonged there naturally. But what struck me wasn't what he was saying, it was how easily he believed it. Every decision he made that evening, every suggestion, every assumption, was based on the belief that consequences were distant, abstract, or irrelevant. That belief shaped everything at the table. My mother leaned slightly forward, adjusting her tone as she spoke. "It's nice to enjoy a proper family dinner once in a while," she said, looking around as if appreciating the moment more deeply. There was a softness in her voice that suggested satisfaction with the evening, with the setting, with the idea of togetherness. My father finally spoke a little more than usual. "We don't do this often," he said, "so it's fine to spend a little more today." That sentence, simple as it was, seemed to settle the question for everyone. It was the justification they needed. My brother nodded as if confirming a decision already made. "Exactly," he said. "It's not every day." That phrase, "not every day," became the quiet permission for everything that followed. Additional orders were placed without hesitation. Suggestions turned into confirmations. The table grew heavier with food and lighter in awareness. I stayed quiet, observing how quickly responsibility was being replaced by comfort. There was no resistance anymore, only flow. Every choice reinforced the last one, building momentum that no one was stopping to question. The waiter returned again, briefly pausing near our table. His eyes moved across the setup quickly, professionally, before continuing. That small pause was enough for me to notice again the same controlled awareness I had seen earlier. It wasn't fear, it wasn't confusion, it was recognition of something not yet revealed. My brother noticed nothing. He was too engaged in the moment, too comfortable in the idea that everything around him was aligned with his choices. He leaned slightly forward again, picking up his fork. "This is how life should feel," he said casually. "No pressure, no limits, just enjoying what you've earned." My mother nodded once more, clearly influenced by his tone rather than examining the statement itself. My father gave another quiet agreement. No one questioned what had been earned or how, or what limits actually meant in a place like this. The table had now become filled to a point where it was difficult to distinguish between planned ordering and impulse continuation. Dishes overlapped, glasses were refilled automatically, and the sense of tracking anything was slowly fading into background comfort. And yet, despite all of this, what stood out most to me wasn't the food or the conversation. It was the certainty in their behavior, the certainty that nothing needed to be checked, nothing needed to be considered, and nothing could possibly disrupt the assumption that everything was already under control. My brother leaned back again, satisfied with the direction of the evening. "We should do this more often," he said. "It's actually important to enjoy life properly." My mother smiled softly at the idea. My father gave one final nod of agreement. And I remained where I was, silent, aware, and watching as their version of control continued expanding, without any of them realizing how much they had already assumed was safe while the dinner continued unfolding around us, with growing weight and quiet tension beneath it all. The waiter returned to the table with a leather folder in his hands, moving with the same calm precision he had maintained throughout the evening. At first, it didn't attract much attention. My family was still mid-conversation, my brother speaking confidently about enjoying life, my mother nodding occasionally, and my father finishing another bite of food without interruption. The moment itself seemed ordinary, just another step in the rhythm of dinner service. But I noticed the change in the waiter's behavior immediately. His movement slowed slightly as he approached our table. Not nervous, not hesitant, but deliberate. He positioned himself with careful balance, standing at a respectful distance while holding the folder in both hands. His eyes briefly scanned the table, not in confusion, but in awareness of timing. It was subtle enough that anyone not paying attention would miss it entirely. "Excuse me," he said politely, placing the folder gently on the table in front of my father. My father paused mid-motion, looked at the folder, and nodded slightly. My mother stopped speaking for a moment, her attention shifting toward it. My brother leaned forward, curious but still relaxed, as if expecting nothing more than a routine bill to split or review later. The atmosphere didn't change at first. It still felt casual, almost predictable. My father opened the folder. That was the exact moment everything shifted. His eyes scanned the page slowly. At first, there was no reaction, just reading. Then a slight pause. Then a second pass over the numbers, slower this time. I watched his expression carefully, noticing how his posture subtly changed. His shoulders, which had been relaxed all evening, became slightly rigid. The hand holding the folder tightened almost imperceptibly. My mother leaned closer. "Is everything okay?" she asked gently, sensing something but not yet understanding it. My father didn't answer immediately. He kept looking at the bill, as if confirming whether what he was seeing was correct. The silence at the table began to stretch in a way that felt different from earlier silences. This one had weight. My brother, still unaware of the shift, let out a small laugh. "How bad can it be?" he said lightly, leaning forward to look at the folder himself. That was when he saw it. The change in his expression was immediate. The confidence that had carried him throughout the evening didn't disappear slowly. It broke in an instant. His eyebrows tightened slightly as his eyes moved across the numbers. He blinked once, then again, as if expecting the figure to change. "What is this?" he said quietly. though still trying to maintain a casual tone. My mother now fully leaned in, her eyes following the same path across the page. I watched her expression shift from curiosity to confusion, then a faint tightening around her eyes. My father still said nothing, but the way he held the folder now suggested he was recalculating something internally. The number on the bill was not something they were prepared for. My brother let out a short laugh again, but it didn't sound confident this time. It was more reflex than reaction. "This has to be wrong," he said, glancing toward the waiter, who was still standing calmly beside the table. The waiter did not react. He simply maintained polite silence, hands folded, expression neutral. That silence itself added clarity to the situation. It wasn't a mistake. My mother looked up from the folder toward the waiter. "Is this correct?" she asked softly, her voice now noticeably different. "Yes, ma'am," the waiter replied calmly. "Everything has been itemized as per your orders." There was no hesitation in his response, no uncertainty, just confirmation. My father slowly placed the folder back on the table, but did not close it. His expression had changed completely now. No longer relaxed, no longer casual. He looked at the table, then at the plates, then briefly around the restaurant, as if trying to understand how the situation had escalated without his awareness. My brother shifted in his seat. The earlier confidence was gone, replaced by something closer to disbelief. "We didn't order that much," he said, though even he didn't sound fully convinced anymore. My mother started scanning the items listed, her finger tracing the lines slowly. The more she read, the quieter she became. Every dish, every drink, every addition from earlier in the evening was accounted for. Nothing was missing. Nothing was exaggerated. I remained silent, watching all of them process it in real time. The waiter stepped slightly back, still present but no longer the focus. The table had fully shifted inward now, all attention fixed on the folder, on the numbers, on the realization building in layers. My father finally exhaled slowly, placing his hand on the table. It wasn't a dramatic reaction, but it carried resignation. My mother looked at my brother briefly, as if searching for explanation. My brother, who had spoken confidently about enjoyment and freedom all evening, now stared at the bill with a stillness that was very different from earlier confidence. No one spoke for a moment. The conversation that had filled the table all evening disappeared completely, replaced by a quiet awareness that something they had never considered had now become unavoidable. And I sat there, observing how quickly certainty turns into uncertainty when reality finally enters a space that had been built entirely on assumption, while the bill remained open on the table, and no one was ready to speak again. The silence that followed the opening of the bill did not feel like ordinary silence. It felt heavier, denser, as if the air around the table had changed its texture. My father's hand rested near the folder, but no one reached for it again. My mother was still looking at the itemized list, slowly moving her eyes from one line to another, as if expecting it to rearrange itself into something more manageable. My brother, who had spent most of the evening speaking with confidence and ease, now sat slightly forward, staring at the total without saying anything. Mm-mm. The number on the bill had already done its work. It didn't need to be repeated or explained. It had created a moment where everyone's assumptions had to pause. The comfortable flow that had carried the dinner for hours suddenly had no direction. Even the background noise of the restaurant felt distant now, as if our table had been placed slightly outside of normal time. My father finally broke the silence, but not with words of certainty. His voice was low, controlled, but different from earlier. "This is," he started, then stopped, as if deciding how to continue. He looked at the total again, then leaned back slightly in his chair. The posture that had been relaxed throughout the evening now carried weight. My mother placed the menu down slowly, her expression tightening just a little. "We didn't realize it would come to this much," she said quietly, not blaming anyone directly, but clearly trying to process the situation. Her voice was softer than before, less confident, more careful. My brother let out a short breath and leaned back as well, though his movement lacked the ease he had shown earlier. "It's just a lot," he said, almost to himself. He glanced again at the waiter, then at the table, then back at the bill. The confidence he had built throughout the evening was no longer visible. It hadn't disappeared dramatically. It had simply stopped holding shape. The waiter remained standing nearby, respectful and still. He did not interrupt the moment. His presence was quiet, neutral, but steady. There was no pressure in his posture, no urgency in his expression. He was simply waiting, as trained, for the situation to resolve itself. My father finally spoke again, this time more practical. "We should review this properly," he said, taking the folder again. His eyes moved more carefully now, focusing not just on the total, but on the breakdown. He wasn't reacting emotionally anymore. He had shifted into calculation, into understanding what had led to this point. My mother leaned in slightly, now trying to make sense of each section. "It must be the extra items," she said softly, as if trying to locate a reason that could reduce the weight of the number. She was not wrong, but she was not fully aware of how many small decisions had contributed to it either. My brother stayed quiet for a moment longer, then spoke again, though more carefully this time. "We did order a bit more than usual," he admitted, but even that sounded less like confidence and more like realization. He rubbed his fingers together slightly, a small gesture that showed discomfort rather than control. I watched all of this without interruption. The shift was not dramatic in movement, but it was clear in structure. Earlier, my brother had been leading the conversation effortlessly. Now he was no longer leading anything. My parents, who had followed his tone throughout the evening, were now focused on the reality in front of them rather than the mood he created. The waiter finally stepped slightly closer again, sensing the need for clarity. "If you would like, I can go through any specific items with you," he said politely. My father nodded once. "Yes," he replied, more composed now. "Let's go through it." As the waiter began to explain, item by item, the table became more focused. My mother pointed at certain entries, asking quiet questions. My father listened carefully, occasionally nodding. My brother remained mostly silent, occasionally glancing at the numbers but no longer speaking with ease. The explanation did not change the amount, but it changed the understanding. Each item was real. Each decision was accounted for. There was no error, no miscalculation, no exaggeration. The bill reflected exactly what had been consumed. As the clarity settled in, my father closed the folder slowly, but did not push it away. It stayed on the table, present and unavoidable. My mother leaned back slightly, her expression now calmer, but more thoughtful. My brother looked down at the table, avoiding eye contact with the bill for a moment longer. The atmosphere at the table had shifted completely. Not into chaos, not into confrontation, but into awareness. The illusion of effortless enjoyment had been replaced by the reality of accumulated decisions. And in that quiet moment, without anyone saying it directly, it was clear that the evening had moved into a different stage entirely, while the bill remained between them and the silence continued to hold its place without interruption. The silence at the table did not break immediately after the explanation. It stretched longer than anyone was comfortable with, but no one seemed willing to be the first to fully acknowledge what it meant. The folder remained closed now, sitting in the center of the table like a fixed point that everyone's attention kept returning to without directly looking at it for too long. My father adjusted his posture slightly, placing both hands on the table. His expression had settled into something more controlled now, but less certain. He was not reacting emotionally anymore. Instead, he was processing. My mother sat quietly, her eyes moving between the bill and the table setting, as if trying to mentally reconstruct how the evening had reached this point. My brother, however, showed the most visible change. He was no longer relaxed in his chair. His body leaned slightly forward, then back again, as if he could not find a comfortable position within the realization unfolding in front of him. He cleared his throat once, a small sound that felt unusually loud in the quiet space between them. "Dad," he began, then paused. It was the first time his voice had lost its earlier ease. "It's just a bit higher than expected." My father did not respond immediately. He looked at the table, then briefly at the folder again. The word expected hung in the air longer than intended. Expectations, after all, had been part of the problem from the beginning. They had expected comfort, expected affordability, expected control over the situation, without ever verifying the limits of it. My mother finally spoke, her tone softer than before. "We should just review everything calmly," she said, almost as if trying to restore order through language alone. She reached for the menu again, but did not open it. Instead, she placed it back down slowly, realizing there was no need to revisit choices that had already been made. The waiter stood slightly aside, maintaining respectful distance. He did not interrupt. He had already done his part in explaining, and now his role was observation and patience. His presence, however, added to the awareness in the room. It reminded everyone that this situation existed beyond just the four of us. It existed within a system that had already been finalized. My brother finally leaned back again, but this time the movement lacked confidence. "We can manage it," he said, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. He looked briefly at my father, searching for reassurance, but found none immediately. My father exhaled slowly. "We are not saying we can't manage it," he replied carefully. His voice was steady, but different from earlier in the evening. It carried the weight of recalculation rather than assumption. "We are just understanding what has happened." That distinction mattered. It shifted the moment from reaction to realization. There was no immediate panic, but there was awareness that something had moved beyond their casual expectations. My mother nodded slightly, as if accepting that explanation. "It's just more than usual," she said again, quietly reinforcing what had already been observed. My brother rubbed his hand across his forehead briefly, then looked at the table again. The confidence he had carried throughout the evening had not disappeared in a single moment, but it was clearly no longer supporting him in the same way. "I didn't think it would add up like this," he admitted, more quietly than before. No one responded to that immediately. There was no need to argue or confirm it. The numbers had already spoken for themselves. My father finally reached for the folder again, opening it once more. This time he did not rush through it. He went line by line, not because he doubted its accuracy, but because he was now trying to understand the structure behind it. My mother leaned slightly closer again, following along more carefully. My brother remained mostly still, watching without speaking. As they went through it again, the tone of the table continued to shift. It was no longer about enjoyment or opinion. It was about clarity. Every item listed was a reminder of a choice made earlier without hesitation, each one small on its own, but significant when combined. The waiter waited patiently until it became clear no further explanation was needed. Only then did he speak again. "Would you like some time before proceeding?" he asked respectfully. My father nodded once. "Yes," he said. "A few minutes." The waiter gave a slight bow of acknowledgement and stepped back. Once he moved away, the silence returned. But it was different now. It was not confusion anymore. It was awareness settling in layers. My mother looked down at her hands. My father kept his focus on the table without speaking. My brother stared at the edge of the bill, no longer speaking confidently, no longer guiding the tone of the table. For the first time that evening, no one tried to continue the performance. No one tried to make the situation feel lighter than it was. The reality had already done that work on its own. I remained seated exactly where I had been throughout, observing how quickly certainty dissolves when it meets something it did not anticipate, while the table stayed quiet and the realization continued to sit heavily between them, without needing any further explanation as the night moved forward in a direction no one at the table had prepared for. Earlier anymore. The waiter stepped slightly back from the table, maintaining his respectful distance, but his presence still lingered in the space around us. Even without speaking, he had become part of the situation simply by standing nearby. The silence at the table was no longer empty. It was filled with understanding that no one had fully accepted yet. My father finally closed the folder again, this time more deliberately. He placed it flat on the table, aligning it carefully as if order could restore control. His expression was steady, but the earlier confidence was gone. Instead, there was a calm, practical focus. the kind people use when they realize something needs to be handled rather than avoided. "We need to settle this properly," he said in a controlled tone. It wasn't panic, but it wasn't casual either. It was responsibility returning after being ignored for too long. My mother nodded slowly. "Yes," she agreed, her voice softer than earlier in the evening. She was no longer looking at the table with admiration or comfort. Now her attention was fully on the reality of what had accumulated in front of them. My brother shifted in his seat again, this time less controlled than before. "Of course we'll settle it," he said quickly, almost too quickly. The confidence in his voice tried to return, but it did not fully hold. "It's just unexpected." The word unexpected hovered in the air again, but now it sounded weaker than before. It no longer explained anything. It only described the gap between assumption and reality. My father glanced at him briefly. "We will handle it," he said, more firmly this time, not as reassurance but as instruction to remain composed. Then he turned slightly toward the waiter, who was still waiting nearby. "You can proceed," my father said calmly. "We will take care of the payment." The waiter nodded respectfully. "Of course, sir," he replied. There was no change in his expression, no indication of judgment or surprise. His professionalism remained consistent, as if this moment was just another part of his routine. But I noticed again that brief awareness in his eyes before he turned away. He understood more than he showed, yet chose not to express it. As he stepped back toward the counter area, the table remained in its altered state. The conversation did not restart immediately. Instead, there was a shared stillness that no one was trying to break too quickly. My mother adjusted her chair slightly. "We just didn't expect it to add up this way," she said quietly, almost to herself more than anyone else. My father responded without looking at her directly. "We should have paid more attention earlier," he said. It wasn't blame, just recognition of oversight. My brother leaned forward slightly again, rubbing his fingers together. "It's fine," he said, though his voice was less steady. "We just didn't realize how much we ordered." No one disagreed with him, but no one reinforced it either. The earlier pattern of agreement had weakened. Now every statement stood on its own, without automatic support. I remained quiet, observing how quickly control shifts when assumptions are replaced by facts. Earlier in the evening, my brother's words guided the flow of the table. Now his words were just part of the conversation, no longer steering it. My father looked toward the bill again, then back at the table. "We will settle it," he repeated, this time more grounded. "Let's just remain calm." My mother nodded, taking a slow breath. "Yes," she said again, as if grounding herself in the idea of calmness rather than reaction. My brother leaned back slightly, trying to regain composure. "It's not a problem," he added, though now it sounded more like reassurance to himself than to anyone else. "We just need to be careful next time." That last phrase, "next time," felt different in tone. It implied a continuation, a lesson being absorbed, a correction being noted. The waiter returned shortly after, bringing the card machine. He placed it gently on the edge of the table and stepped back again, giving space. My father reached for it without hesitation this time. There was no longer discussion, only execution. He inserted the card and waited, his expression neutral but focused. My mother watched quietly. My brother looked away briefly, then back again. No one spoke during the transaction. The small machine beeped softly, confirming the process. When it was done, the waiter returned, collected the machine, and gave a polite nod. "Thank you," he said simply. "Everything is complete." My father gave a small nod in return. "Thank you," he replied. The waiter stepped away again and the table returned to silence, but this silence was different from before. It was no longer about shock or disbelief. It was about processing what had already been resolved. My mother finally relaxed her shoulders slightly. My brother exhaled and leaned back more fully, though still not fully at ease. My father placed both hands on the table, steady and composed again, but reflective now. No one returned to earlier topics. No one tried to restore the mood that had existed before. The evening had clearly moved past that point. I observed all of it without interruption, noticing how quickly confidence fades when structure replaces assumption, while the table remained still and the weight of realization continued settling into their silence without any need for further words between them, as the night continued without returning to how it had been before anymore. The payment had been processed, and the immediate tension at the table had started to settle into something quieter, more reflective. The waiter had already stepped away, leaving us alone again. But the atmosphere was no longer the same as before. Nothing dramatic had been said after the transaction, yet something fundamental had shifted in the way everyone was sitting, breathing, and avoiding eye contact with the bill that no longer mattered, but still lingered in memory. My father remained composed, but there was a noticeable stillness in him now. Not discomfort, not anger, just reflection. He kept his hands on the table for a moment longer than usual, as if grounding himself after recalculating the evening internally. My mother sat quietly, her earlier expressions of admiration for the restaurant replaced with a more neutral awareness. She occasionally looked around the space, but no longer with excitement. It was more like she was trying to understand how perception and reality had diverged so easily without anyone noticing in time. My brother was the most visibly affected, even though he tried not to show it. He leaned back in his chair, then adjusted his posture again, then picked up his glass and put it back down without drinking. His earlier confidence, the ease with which he had controlled the tone of the evening, had not completely disappeared, but it was no longer stable. It surfaced briefly in small gestures, but did not hold. "It's fine," he said again, quieter than before. "We just miscalculated a bit." No one responded immediately. The phrase hung in the air without reinforcement. Earlier in the evening, statements like his would have been followed by agreement, smiles, or nods. Now they were simply acknowledged by silence. My father finally spoke after a few seconds. "It's not about miscalculation," he said calmly. "It's about not paying attention." His tone was not harsh. It was factual. That made it heavier. My brother looked at him briefly but didn't respond. My mother lowered her gaze slightly, absorbing the statement without adding anything. The restaurant around us continued as usual. Other tables were still engaged in conversations, laughter, and casual dining. Waiters moved smoothly between guests, maintaining the same polished rhythm. From the outside, nothing about our table would have seemed unusual. But internally, the energy had completely changed. My brother eventually cleared his throat and tried to shift the tone again. "Anyway," he said, attempting lightness, "it was still a good dinner." My mother gave a small nod, not fully agreeing, but not rejecting the idea either. "Yes," she said softly. "The food was good." My father added a brief acknowledgement. "The place is well managed," he said, looking around the room once more. The conversation, however, did not regain its earlier flow. It remained fragmented, careful, and slower than before. There was no longer a shared narrative guiding it. Each person was speaking from their own position rather than a collective mood. I stayed quiet, observing the subtle differences in how they were processing the same experience. My brother seemed focused on restoring normalcy through casual statements. My mother appeared to be absorbing the emotional weight of the evening more privately. My father was analyzing it structurally, as if reviewing a sequence of decisions rather than an event. No one mentioned the earlier confidence that had filled the table. No one revisited the assumptions that had guided the ordering, the conversation, or the tone of the dinner. Instead, everything was now being viewed through the lens of outcome rather than expectation. My brother leaned slightly forward again. "We just got carried away," he said, this time more honestly. "It happens." That statement was not challenged, but it was also not reinforced. It simply existed in the space, neither confirmed nor denied. My mother finally looked toward me briefly, then away again. There was something in her expression that suggested reconsideration, though she did not voice it. My father remained steady, but quieter than before, his focus no longer on the table or the food, but somewhere internally. The waiter passed by once more in the distance, now attending to other tables. His presence was no longer central to our situation, but the memory of his earlier involvement still lingered in the structure of the evening. He had been part of the transition, the point where perception met reality without confrontation. My brother finally let out a slow breath. "It's over now," he said, as if trying to define the situation into closure. My father nodded once. "Yes," he agreed. "It's over." My mother repeated the sentiment softly, more to herself than anyone else. "It's over." But even with those words, nothing about the atmosphere returned to what it had been earlier in the evening. The dinner had technically ended in terms of transaction, but not in terms of realization. I looked at them again, noticing how each of them was now sitting with their own interpretation of what had happened. None of them were fully speaking about it, yet all of them were clearly thinking about it in different ways. And in that quiet space after resolution, where conversation no longer carried urgency and assumptions had already been tested, the evening continued forward in silence that no one at the table was trying to break anymore, while everything around us remained unchanged but internally completely different from how it had begun before the bill arrived at all. The table remained quiet for a while after the bill had been settled, but it was no longer the same kind of silence as before. Earlier, silence had been filled with shock and calculation. Now it was filled with reflection and an awkward sense of awareness that no one was openly addressing. The immediate urgency had passed, but what remained was the slow realization of everything that had led to that moment. My father was the first to move slightly out of that stillness. He adjusted his posture, straightening his back, then looked around the table, as if re-establishing his presence in the situation. His expression was calm again, but different from earlier in the evening. There was no longer assumption or ease. It was now controlled awareness. He exhaled slowly and spoke in a steady tone. "We should head out soon." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a transition. A quiet acknowledgement that the dinner, in every meaningful sense, had concluded. My mother nodded gently, taking a moment to collect herself before responding. "Yes," she said softly. "It's getting late." My brother, however, lingered in his seat slightly longer. He looked down at the table, then around the restaurant again, as if trying to reconnect with the version of the evening he had imagined earlier. The confidence that had carried him through most of the dinner was still there, but it felt muted now, less dominant. "Yeah," he finally said, pushing his chair back slightly. "We should go." No one spoke about the bill again. Not because it was forgotten, but because it had already been processed internally by each of them in different ways. The conversation had moved past numbers and into reflection, even if unspoken. The waiter approached one final time to confirm that everything was complete. My father thanked him politely, and the exchange remained brief and professional. There was no additional explanation needed. The transaction had already closed both practically and symbolically. After a short acknowledgement, the waiter stepped away, leaving us to gather ourselves. My mother reached for her handbag and began organizing her belongings slowly. Her movements were careful, almost thoughtful, as if she was still mentally reviewing the evening. My father stood first, adjusting his jacket with quiet precision. My brother followed shortly after, though his movements lacked the same earlier ease. The energy that had once been relaxed and confident at the start of the dinner was no longer present in any of them. I stood as well, observing how naturally everyone transitioned into departure without discussing what had actually changed. There was an unspoken agreement that the evening would not be analyzed further in that moment. It was easier to move forward physically than to unpack everything mentally at the table. As we began walking out of the restaurant, the environment around us felt slightly different than when we had entered. The lighting was the same, the atmosphere unchanged, the staff still moving with precision, yet our perception of it had shifted. What once felt like luxury now felt like context. What once felt like enjoyment now felt like experience, with consequence attached. My brother walked slightly ahead, then slowed to match the rest of us. "It was still a good place," he said after a moment, breaking the silence. His tone was casual, but there was a subtle effort behind it, as if trying to restore some normality to the situation. My mother responded gently. "Yes, it was nice." My father gave a short nod but did not add anything more. There was no disagreement, but also no enthusiasm. Just acknowledgement. I remained slightly behind them, watching how each of them processed the same evening differently. My brother seemed to be trying to reframe it as a simple experience. My mother appeared to be softening it into something emotionally neutral. My father, however, seemed focused on structure, what had happened, why it had happened, and what it revealed in terms of attention and judgment. Outside the restaurant, the night air felt cooler and quieter. The contrast between the controlled interior and the open space outside was noticeable, even without anyone commenting on it. My mother adjusted her shawl slightly. My father paused briefly near the entrance, looking back at the building for a moment before continuing forward. My brother finally spoke again as we began walking. "Anyway," he said, "it's done now." That phrase carried a sense of closure, as if speaking it made the experience settle into something contained. My mother nodded again. My father did not respond verbally, but continued walking at a steady pace. I followed behind them, observing how quickly human minds try to categorize events into completed sections, even when the internal processing is still ongoing. Nothing had been discussed openly beyond surface-level acknowledgement, yet everything had clearly changed in subtle ways. My brother adjusted his pace again to walk beside my father. "We'll plan better next time," he added lightly, as if trying to regain control over the narrative of future events. My father responded after a brief pause. "Yes," he said. "We will be more attentive." There was no argument in that statement, just acceptance of adjustment. My mother walked slightly behind them now, quiet, reflective, still carrying the weight of the evening in her own way. I remained behind all of them, watching the distance between what had been expected earlier and what had actually occurred settle into something unspoken. And as we continued moving away from the restaurant, the conversation faded completely, replaced by a silence that no longer needed explanation or correction, while the night stretched ahead of us, and nothing at the table remained the same as it had been before the bill ever arrived. At all, the walk away from the restaurant felt longer than usual, not because of distance, but because of the silence that followed us. No one was speaking now, and the absence of conversation made every small sound more noticeable. The footsteps on the pavement, the distant traffic, and the faint hum of the city around us. The dinner was over, but its weight had not fully left any of us. My father walked slightly ahead, maintaining his usual steady pace. His posture was straight, controlled, but there was something thoughtful in the way he moved. It wasn't urgency anymore. It was reflection. Every few seconds, his gaze shifted slightly downward, as if replaying parts of the evening internally. My mother walked a little behind him, quiet and composed, holding her bag close, her expression calm but distant. My brother was the first to break the silence, though his voice came out softer than earlier in the evening. "It's actually colder outside," he said, as if trying to start something simple, something normal. My mother responded gently, "Yes, it is." That was all. No continuation followed. The conversation didn't grow from there. It simply existed for a moment, and then disappeared again. My brother adjusted his jacket and looked around, then ahead, then down at the ground. He was trying in small ways to return to the version of himself he had been earlier in the evening, but something in his expression suggested it wasn't fully working. I walked slightly behind them, observing the distance between what had been spoken at the table and what remained unsaid now. The shift was subtle, but clear. Earlier, confidence had shaped every sentence my brother spoke. My parents had followed that tone, reinforcing it without question. Now, outside, that structure no longer held in the same way. We passed a few pedestrians, strangers moving in different directions, each carrying their own separate evening. No one noticed anything unusual about our group. To them, we were just another family walking after dinner. But internally, the dynamic had changed. My father finally spoke again after a few minutes. "We should be more careful in situations like this," he said, still looking ahead. It wasn't directed at anyone specifically, but everyone understood the meaning. My mother nodded slightly. "Yes," she agreed softly. There was no resistance in her tone, only acceptance. My brother gave a small sound of acknowledgement, but didn't immediately respond with words. He seemed to be thinking. The earlier ease he had carried at the restaurant was no longer visible in the same form. It had been replaced with something more subdued, more measured. After a moment, he said, "We just didn't realize how quickly it adds up." That sentence carried less confidence than before. It was not an excuse, but a realization. My father did not argue with it. Instead, he responded calmly, "That is exactly why attention matters." Again, there was no tension in his voice, just clarity. We continued walking. The city lights reflected on the pavement, creating small patterns that moved as we passed them. Everything around us looked unchanged, but internally, the experience of the evening was still unfolding in each of us differently. My mother finally spoke again, her tone quiet. "It was still a nice evening," she said, as if trying to preserve something positive from the experience. My father nodded once. "Yes," he agreed. It was. My brother didn't respond immediately. He looked ahead, then slightly to the side. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "It was good." But none of these confirmations carried the same energy they would have earlier. They were softer now, more reflective, less certain. I remained silent, watching how each of them was trying to stabilize their interpretation of what had happened. My brother seemed focused on reducing it to a simple lesson. My mother was focusing on emotional balance. My father was analyzing structure and oversight. Each of them was processing the same event, but through completely different internal frameworks. We reached a quieter stretch of the road, where traffic was less frequent. The sound of footsteps became more noticeable again. My mother adjusted her pace slightly to match the others. My father slowed just a little, allowing the group to walk together more evenly. My brother broke the silence once more, though more carefully this time. "Next time, we'll just plan it better," he said. My father responded after a short pause. "Yes, planning and awareness." There was agreement, but no excitement in it. Just acknowledgement in it. Just acknowledgement of adjustment. My mother gave a small nod, though she did not add anything further. The idea of "next time" felt like an attempt to restore control over something that had already shifted. As we continued walking, the earlier structure of the evening no longer defined the conversation. It had dissolved into quiet reflection, where each person was now processing their own version of the same experience without fully expressing it aloud. The city around us moved normally, but within our group, something had already been redefined. And no one needed to say it directly anymore for it to remain present between us as we walked forward in silence without returning to what had been said earlier, at the table again. The walk continued in silence for a while, but it was no longer the same kind of silence as before. Earlier, silence had felt heavy with realization and reflection. Now it felt more settled, like something slowly being accepted rather than actively processed. The initial shock of the evening had faded, leaving behind a quieter, more internal understanding in each of us. My father kept a steady pace at the front, hands relaxed at his sides. His face no longer showed tension, but there was still a thoughtful distance in his expression. He seemed focused on something beyond the present moment, as if reviewing the entire sequence of the evening step by step. Every now and then, his eyes would narrow slightly, not in frustration, but in analysis. My mother walked closer to him now, matching his pace more naturally. She had regained her usual calm demeanor, but it was different from earlier in the evening. It wasn't the calm of comfort anymore. It was the calm of adjustment. Her thoughts seemed inward, and she occasionally glanced down at the ground while walking, as if organizing her own interpretation of what had happened. My brother, who had been unusually quiet for a while, finally spoke again. "It's not something we'll forget easily," he said, his voice low but steady. No one responded immediately. The sentence didn't need correction or agreement. It simply existed as a shared acknowledgement. After a few seconds, my father replied, "No, it will be remembered properly." That response carried a different tone than before. It was not emotional, but structured. It suggested that the evening was no longer being viewed as an unexpected disruption, but as a reference point for future decisions. We continued walking through a slightly busier street, where passing vehicles and distant conversations filled the background. Yet even in that environment, our group remained internally separate. Each of us was still inside our own interpretation of the evening. My brother adjusted his jacket again and looked ahead. "We just got carried away with the moment," he said, almost as if clarifying it for himself more than anyone else. "It happens when you're not thinking about it too closely." My mother gave a soft, almost automatic response. "Yes," she said, "that can happen." My father did not immediately respond this time. Instead, he seemed to consider the statement before speaking. "It wasn't just the moment," he finally said. "It was attention." The word attention changed the tone slightly again. It shifted the focus from circumstance to behavior, from environment to awareness. My brother didn't argue with it, but he also didn't fully respond. He simply nodded once, slowly. The streetlights above us created alternating patches of brightness and shadow as we walked forward. In those shifting lights, each of us looked slightly different depending on the moment. But the internal distance between us remained consistent. My mother eventually spoke again, her voice quieter than before. "We should probably be more mindful in general," she said, as if extending the lesson beyond just the evening. My father nodded. "Yes," he agreed. "Mindfulness is necessary." There was no disagreement in the group anymore, but also no strong agreement. It had become a shared understanding rather than a discussion. Each person was arriving at their own conclusions without needing to challenge the others. My brother glanced briefly toward me, then looked away again. He didn't say anything at first, but after a moment, he spoke. "You've been quiet the whole time," he said, not in the same teasing tone as earlier, but more observational now. My mother also looked back briefly. My father didn't turn, but he seemed aware of the shift in attention. "I've been listening," I said simply. There was no reaction to that statement, not because it was ignored, but because it did not require interpretation anymore. The dynamic that had existed earlier in the evening, where silence needed explanation, had changed. We walked a little further before my brother spoke again. "Maybe we just didn't account for everything properly," he said. His tone was more reflective now. "That's all." My father responded after a short pause. "Accounting is not just numbers," he said. "It is awareness of decisions." My mother nodded slightly. "Yes," she agreed again. The conversation did not continue beyond that. It didn't need to. Each sentence now felt like part of a slow restructuring of how the evening was being understood internally. We passed another intersection, pausing briefly to let vehicles pass. During that pause, no one spoke. The silence was no longer uncomfortable. It had become natural, like space needed for processing rather than avoidance. When we resumed walking, the pace was slightly slower. Not intentionally, but naturally adjusted. My father no longer led with urgency. My mother stayed close beside him. My brother walked slightly behind, no longer trying to guide the direction of conversation. I remained at the back again, observing how the evening had shifted from external experience to internal reflection. Nothing more needed to be said out loud for the understanding to continue forming quietly within each of them, while we moved forward through the city, without returning to earlier assumptions or trying to recreate what had already changed completely by now. The walk had become slower without anyone consciously deciding it. There was no longer urgency in our steps, only a steady movement forward as the night continued around us. The earlier tension had faded, replaced by something quieter and more settled, as if the evening had finally moved into its final stage of reflection rather than reaction. My father walked at the front, but now he occasionally matched his pace with my mother instead of leading ahead. His posture remained straight, but his expression was softer than before. He was no longer analyzing the bill or the restaurant in active thought. Instead, his attention seemed to be on the broader pattern of what had happened, as if placing the experience into a mental category for future reference. My mother stayed close to him, her hands still holding her bag tightly, though not out of stress anymore. It had become a habitual grip rather than a sign of tension. She looked ahead calmly, occasionally glancing at the road, but her thoughts were clearly inward. The earlier emotional shift had settled into acceptance. She was no longer reacting to the evening. She was absorbing it. My brother walked slightly behind them, quieter than at any other point in the night. The confidence he had carried into the restaurant, and even through most of the dinner, was no longer visible in the same way. It hadn't disappeared completely, but it had transformed into something more restrained. He was thinking more than speaking now. After a while, he broke the silence. "It's strange how quickly things change when you're not paying full attention," he said. No one immediately responded. The sentence didn't require agreement or disagreement. It simply added to the shared understanding that had been forming since we left the restaurant. My father finally replied after a few seconds. "It is not about speed," he said calmly. "It is about accumulation." That statement shifted the tone slightly again. It reframed the evening not as a sudden event, but as something built gradually through small decisions. My brother didn't respond right away. He seemed to consider it, looking ahead rather than at anyone else. My mother spoke softly after a moment. "We usually don't notice things until they add up," she said. My father nodded once. "That is exactly the point," he replied. The conversation, such as it was, remained minimal. There was no debate, no correction, no emotional reaction. Each sentence added another layer of understanding rather than conflict. We passed a quieter stretch of road where fewer people were walking. The sound of traffic was distant, and the streetlights created long shadows across the pavement. In that quieter space, the absence of noise made every thought feel more present, even if unspoken. My brother adjusted his pace slightly to walk closer to my father. "So it's really just awareness then," he said, more reflective now than argumentative. My father responded without hesitation. "Awareness and responsibility," he said. "Both are required." My brother nodded slowly, accepting the statement without challenge. There was no resistance left in the conversation, only alignment and understanding. My mother looked ahead and then spoke again. "It feels like we were just not fully present earlier," she said, choosing her words carefully. My father agreed. "Presence was divided," he said simply. That phrase lingered briefly in the air. It didn't need explanation. Everyone understood what it referred to without it being said directly. We continued walking, and the distance between us felt less divided now. Earlier, there had been roles, tones, and assumptions shaping each interaction. Now there was only reflection. Even my brother, who had led most of the evening with confidence, seemed to be in a quieter internal state, processing rather than directing. After a few minutes, he spoke again. "Next time we should just slow down more," he said. "Think before reacting." My father responded after a short pause. "Yes," he said. "Slowing down allows correction." My mother nodded gently. "That would help," she added. There was no further expansion of the idea. It remained a simple conclusion, shared without emphasis. We crossed another street, waiting briefly at the edge for vehicles to pass. During that pause, no one spoke. The silence was no longer heavy or uncomfortable. It felt natural, as if conversation was no longer necessary to hold the group together. When we resumed walking, the pace remained steady but calm. My father no longer seemed preoccupied. My mother appeared more settled. My brother walked with a quieter presence than earlier, no longer trying to define or guide the direction of thought. I remained slightly behind them, observing how the entire evening had transitioned from external performance to internal reflection, and how each of them had reached their own understanding without needing to express everything aloud. While the night continued moving forward with no return to earlier assumptions or interpretations, as we walked together through the quiet streets without further interruption or urgency shaping our steps anymore. We reached the point where the street widened, and the glow of nearby buildings reflected softly on the pavement. The walk had slowed naturally by then, and no one seemed in a hurry to continue or end the conversation. It felt like the evening had reached a quiet conclusion on its own, without any need for announcement. The earlier intensity had fully dissolved, leaving behind a calm that was more reflective than emotional. My father stopped first, near the edge of the sidewalk. Not abruptly, but gently, as if the walk itself had guided him to pause. My mother slowed beside him and stood quietly. My brother came to a stop a moment later, adjusting his stance and looking around briefly before settling his attention forward again. I stopped slightly behind them, watching how the group naturally formed a small circle without anyone instructing it. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. It wasn't the silence of tension anymore. It was the silence of completion, where nothing more needed to be added immediately. My father looked ahead at the street, then slightly down at the ground. His expression was steady, but thoughtful. My mother stood beside him, calmer now, her earlier confusion fully replaced with acceptance and quiet reflection. My brother broke the silence first, but his voice was different from how it had been earlier in the evening. It carried less certainty and more understanding. "I think we all underestimated how the evening would turn out," he said. No one corrected him. No one added anything immediately. The statement was simple, and it didn't require defense or disagreement. My father nodded slowly. "We did not fully observe the details," he said. "That is where the difference came from." My mother adjusted her grip on her bag and spoke softly. "It was just easy to lose track," she said. "Everything felt normal until it wasn't." Her words weren't defensive. They were reflective, as if she was organizing the experience into something understandable. My brother looked down for a moment, then back up. "It's not really about the bill anymore," he said. "It's more about how quickly assumptions can feel like certainty." That statement lingered slightly longer than the others. Not because it was dramatic, but because it felt like a conclusion forming in real time. My father responded after a brief pause. "Assumptions become decisions when they are not checked," he said calmly. "That is the lesson." There was no tension in his voice. It was not a correction, it was an observation. My mother nodded again, quietly agreeing. My brother did not argue. He seemed to accept it fully this time. I stayed silent, watching how each of them had reached their own version of understanding without needing conflict to arrive there. The same evening that had begun with confidence and assumptions had now ended in reflection and recalibration. A car passed nearby, its headlights briefly lighting the street before fading into distance. The world around us continued moving as normal, but our group remained still for a moment longer, as if not ready to break the final pause. My father finally exhaled gently and adjusted his posture. "We should continue," he said after a moment. It wasn't urgency, it was closure turning into movement again. My mother nodded. "Yes," she agreed softly. My brother gave a small nod as well. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go." We started walking again, but the energy was no longer the same as before. The conversation did not resume immediately. Instead, there was a comfortable quiet between us. Not forced, not uncomfortable, just settled. After a few steps, my brother spoke again, this time more lightly. "At least we understand it now," he said. My father responded calmly. "Understanding comes after reflection." My mother added quietly, "And reflection takes time." No one elaborated further. There was no need to expand the thought. It was already understood. We continued walking together, moving through the quiet street with a steadier pace than before. The distance between earlier assumptions and present understanding no longer felt sharp. It had softened into something that could be carried without resistance. My brother walked slightly closer to my father now, no longer ahead or behind in attitude. My mother stayed beside them both. I remained slightly apart, observing how the group had naturally shifted from expectation to awareness without needing any final statement to define it. The night air felt calmer now, and the city around us had returned to its usual rhythm. But within our small group, something had clearly settled into place that did not need further explanation or repetition. As we continued walking forward together in silence, that no longer carried weight, but instead carried understanding that nothing at the table had truly left behind anymore. The evening that began with confidence and casual conversation had slowly unfolded into something far more revealing, not through conflict, but through realization. What seemed like a simple family dinner turned into a quiet lesson in assumptions, attention, and the difference between perception and reality. As the night ended and everyone walked away from the restaurant, nothing dramatic needed to be said anymore, because everything important had already been understood in silence. Sometimes the most unforgettable moments are not the loudest ones, but the ones that make people rethink what they believed was already certain.